Amato from the St. Charles Park District. I'm here this month to talk to you about an animal that you probably have not seen, at least not in real life. You may have heard of it. It's a bird called the passenger pigeon. The reason you might not or probably have not encountered one in real life is because this bird went extinct about 106 years ago, 107. We're in 2021 now, aren't we? This bird was once one of the most populous birds on the planet. It was the species in eastern North America. And as I was preparing today's presentation, I was trying to think of a way we could make this long gone bird kind of come to life. The closest living example I could come up with was the mourning dove. Now, mourning doves, you probably know from seeing at backyard feeders or seeing them lined up on utility wires as you're driving around. We actually have a carved mourning dove that was donated to the nature department. You can see it's a bird with kind of a slender profile, a long tail. The modern day mourning dove is actually a little bit smaller than the passenger pigeon was. Passenger pigeons measure another 2-3 inches in size as compared to the doves that we see today. Passenger pigeons also didn't really resemble the city pigeons that you might be familiar with. Those birds, also known as rock doves or rock pigeons, have a much chunkier and heftier body than the passenger pigeon did. Anyway, what we're going to do today is go through some slides that will hopefully enlighten you a little bit as to what life was like in the day of the passenger pigeon, what led to its demise, and even though that is kind of a sad part of the story, there were some good things that ultimately came of it. So let's take a look now at the slides that tell the story. Gone but not forgotten, remembering the passenger pigeon. Gone but not forgotten, remembering the passenger pigeon. I couldn't believe how lucky I was to find this animation that really tells the story in just a few short seconds, how a species that once numbered in the billions could be winnowed down to just one individual and then suddenly none. What we're going to do today is get to know the bird a little bit better through some look at historic notations, quotes from people who actually witnessed the bird while it was alive and wrote about them either in newspapers or in journals. And then we'll take a look at some of the factors that affected its decline and its ultimate demise. Let's look at the bird itself. Now, in the introduction, I said that it resembled our modern day mourning dove. It does and it doesn't. It was larger in size. It also, you can see in the painting here, you can see it had bright red eyes. The males were quite brightly colored during the breeding season with that kind of a pinkish orange blush across the breast and a bluish back. The females, as is usually the case, had a little bit less in the way of color, but were nonetheless very, very beautiful birds. Check out this quote. So Alexander Wilson was an ornithologist in the late 17 and early 1800s. He wrote that while visiting friends in New England, sitting in the kitchen, suddenly the sky became dark. There was no light in the room and a rumbling noise grew louder. I was certain it was a tornado. Well, when his friends saw how frightened he was, they exclaimed, "Oh, it's only the pigeons flying overhead." So imagine, if you will, that that thunderous event of a huge flock flying overhead. There were accounts in his notes where Wilson estimated flocks to be, one in particular was 2,230,272,000 individual birds. Now, just to put that in a little bit of perspective, if we took all the pigeons, and by pigeons today, we're not talking mourning doves, we're talking about the pigeons on city streets in Chicago and New York and all around the world. If we took every last one of those pigeons and rounded them up, we'd end up with about 260 million. Basically 1/8 the size of the flock that Wilson witnessed. So multitudes of these birds would gather together. It was actually key to their survival. They were extremely gregarious species, and their large numbers kind of guaranteed their success. Now, to give you a little bit more perspective, here's a short clip. This looks at a flock of red-winged blackbirds. There's no doubt there's a lot of birds there, but this flock actually numbers in the hundreds. There's about 800 birds in that flock. That's just a mere drop in the bucket compared to the size of the flocks of those passenger pigeons. Let's take a look at another quote. This is from Simon Polkagon. He was a Potawatomi tribal leader. He wrote about his recollections from watching the passenger pigeons in the 1850s. He said, "I stood by the grandest waterfall of America, and yet I've never have my astonishment, wonder, and admiration been so stirred as when I witnessed these birds drop from their course like meteors from heaven." So I kind of thought a little bit about his quote, and it reminded me of what we see when we see large groups of starlings. Starlings form these flocks that the term for this method of flight is called a murmuration. And I almost wonder if maybe the passenger pigeons flew in a somewhat similar form, or at least created an impression of grandness like this in a synchronized movement. But again, we don't have anything today that nearly compares to the numbers of the passenger pigeon. But thinking about those starlings swirling about and reading Simon's words, there might be a parallel there between these two different species, very, very different. So another quote that has no attribution describes how these birds would feed. In the fall of 1859, I had the opportunity to observe a flock of passenger pigeons feeding. The flock was over a 1/4 mile wide and 300 feet deep. In a few moments, those in the rear, finding the ground stripped of food, arose above the treetops and alighted in front of the advance column. This movement soon became continuous and uniform, birds from the rear flying to the front so rapidly that the whole had the appearance of a rolling cylinder. Having a diameter of about 50 yards, its interior filled with flying leaves and grass. The noise was deafening and the sight confusing to the mind. Much of the passenger pigeon activity took place at a time when there was no such thing as motion pictures. There wasn't even color photography. However, this mural that is on a building in downtown Cincinnati, you'll see in a few slides why Cincinnati is relevant to the story of the passenger pigeon. But it kind of shows, it gives the impression of what it was like to have these great numbers of birds flying through the air, alighting in trees. In fact, when you stop to consider the sheer volume of the birds, you can imagine the effect they had on the trees. There were many accounts of thousands of birds landing in trees, actually breaking branches from their weight. And remember, birds don't really weigh all that much. So to have enough birds to break a branch, to break multiple branches, was really, really incredible. They also created quite a bit of, shall we say, droppings underneath the trees. Now, those two events, they might sound, well, it's not like it's bad for the trees and it's bad for the plants below the trees, but those two events actually kind of replicate natural processes that we still have today. When we have a storm come through, there's some natural pruning that occurs. Of course, we hate to see it in the trees we have planted around our homes, but pruning via storms is a very natural process, as is fire. And while fire will kind of suppress or take away the top layer of vegetation, new vegetation will grow. And as passenger pigeons' droppings hit the floor of the forest or the woods where they landed, they too would suppress the herbaceous layer, the plants growing on the floor of the woodland. However, that in turn created a tremendous diversity of decomposers and things that would clean up those droppings that were left behind and convert them into nutrients to create actually a very rich forest floor. So as they would land in trees during, say, fall migration, they would be going after what we call the mast crop, the beech nuts, the acorns, chestnuts, the seeds and the berries. It's said that the passenger pigeon could hold a half cup of food in its crop. That's quite a bit. That's a small fist size amount of material. And they would feed sometimes to the point where they couldn't move for a while. They would actually fall over, kind of like our the cedar waxwings that we have today, known for their feeding to excess. But they, as you can imagine, had quite an impact on the mast crop of trees. Now, during the breeding season, they supplemented their diet, as birds, many species do, with insects and other invertebrates because of that the protein that was required both for the parents to have energy to raise their young and for the offspring to grow. Now, speaking of offspring, we saw just how huge these flocks of passenger pigeons were. And it wasn't because the individual pairs produced lots of offspring. There's a little bit of debate as to the number of chicks a mated pair of passenger pigeons would have each season. Those numbers are either 1 or 2. There's quite a bit of evidence showing that each pair only raised 1 little chick per year. Now, some nests at the time were found to have 2 eggs in them. That could have been that the female passenger pigeon laid 2 eggs, but a leading theory on that is that sometimes a second female would slip another egg into the nest of a different pair. So anyway, 1 egg, possibly 2 eggs per breeding pair. That's not a very high reproductive rate per pair, but when you consider the number of birds, it did help to keep the population numbers very stable. So here's a depiction of those rolling flocks coming through the air in migration. There's people who wrote about the sky actually darkening because of the sheer volume of birds that were passing overhead. And this activity would occur over much of the eastern United States, even going up into parts of Western Canada. But what you see before you is the supposed range, or what we've been able to piece together as the range of the passenger pigeon at the height of its activity. Now, as we talked about with the mast crops, the birds had quite an impact on the trees, the nuts and the seeds that were produced in the forest. Well, they had a similar effect on the settlers and their planted crops. This drawing depicts farmers trying to save their crops as the passenger pigeons came through in 1867. And the practice of shooting the birds to save your crops was one way that the population was affected by humans. But another one that had a much larger impact was the shooting for sport. Because these birds would fly over in such numbers, people didn't think anything of shooting dozens or hundreds or thousands. In fact, as market hunting came into play, special guns were created that could kill thousands of birds at one time. But towns used to have shooting matches where prizes were awarded to the person who could kill the most birds. Some of the birds were eaten, but some were used as feed for hogs. Some were just left to go to waste. To try and protect, whether it's a forest crop or a agricultural crop, people tried different things. This depicts some large nets that were created. There were nets that the birds would fly into. There were other nets that were actually thrown over the tops of the trees to just kind of encapsulate the thousands and thousands of birds that were roosting in that tree. Once the birds were inside the net, they were bundled together. Of course, a lot of the birds on the interior of those bundles did not survive, but they would be caged and transported. So these two pictures show how other methods were used. You can see on the left-hand picture there, it says throwing the stool pigeon. Stool pigeon has one meaning today, but back when the passenger pigeon was around, the term was coined as the word for a bird that was used as kind of a decoy. You can see that the stool pigeon in that picture has a cord around its legs. It would be tossed up in an effort to lure other passenger pigeons in. On the right-hand side, the decoy trap was a similar method where birds were placed on the ground to lure other birds in. Some people would actually blind some passenger pigeons so that they wouldn't really be able, they wouldn't be very mobile, they wouldn't fly. They could set them out on the ground and attract more birds in that way. So many different ways to lure these birds in to then either be caught or be shot. This text comes from an editorial that was in the magazine or publication Forest and Stream. When the birds appear, all the male inhabitants of the neighborhood leave their customary occupations as farmers, bark peelers, oil scouts, wildcatters, and tavern loafers and join in the work of capturing and marketing the game. The Pennsylvania law very plainly forbids the destruction of the pigeons on their nesting grounds, but no one pays any attention to the law. And the nesting birds have been killed by the thousands and tens of thousands. So in 1886, we're starting to get a bit of an inkling of sounding of an alarm that maybe this widespread killing in these large numbers of birds that are being taken out might not be the best for the species. The thing of it was, wild pigeons, the passenger pigeons, were very tasty. There's all kinds of ways to prepare a passenger pigeon. In fact, if you go online, there's actually a few recipes now that are said to replicate the old style pigeon pies. I believe most of them call for Cornish game hens as the main ingredients, since we're fresh out of passenger pigeons. But passenger pigeons weren't just sustenance, they were actually quite tasty. And that fact, too, played a big role in demise. That was the shooting matches and the trapping that we saw pictures of. Well, that increased many folds over when in the 1870s, the refrigerated boxcar was invented. Prior to that, pigeons were captured and consumed locally, but once the railroads were built, and I believe it was Gustav Swift of the Swift Meatpacking Company who really pioneered refrigerated rail cars. Once that refrigerated rail car came into being, these birds could be packed and shipped all around the country. So there was money to be made. This actually came at a pretty opportune time. The 1870s, 1873, there was a panic on Wall Street, and it was followed by a depression. So there were a lot of people that were hungry. There were some crop failures during those years as well. And if it wasn't for having these large numbers of birds to eat, the times would have been much harder. But as it was, when money was scarce, passenger pigeons were plentiful. So people were able to find food to eat if they were able to hunt or knew someone who was able to hunt. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, there were some other things going on in our country in the late 1800s. There were tremendous numbers of people coming to the country. There was a lot of industry that was growing. There was a need for housing. There was a need for stores and office buildings. So there was a huge need for timber. And again, at this period of history, we didn't really have a lot of laws in place to say, hey, take it easy, don't cut down every single tree. These pictures date to the late 1800s in West Virginia. You can see the picture in the lower right is all that remained once the loggers went through and cut down every last stitch of forest they could find. That led into all sorts of other ecological problems with the clear-cut land, but we're going to focus on what that did to the passenger pigeon. As a bird of the forest, losing the trees that it needed to roost on, this kind of eliminated large parts of their territory, kind of causing them to concentrate in areas where then hunters, market hunters in particular, people who are looking to make money by selling off the dead birds that they shot, kind of accelerated the decline of the species. So as we got into the very late 1800s and early 1900s, it was becoming apparent that the numbers of these birds had decreased dramatically. And there were some efforts to try and bring the species back. This is a photo of an aviary that was owned by Professor Whitman. He was a professor of zoology at the University of Chicago. He had 7 passenger pigeons, which actually sounds like a pretty good number. If any of you have ever kept pet birds, 7 birds can be quite a bit to have to keep up. But in passenger pigeon numbers and scale, and is the biology of the bird dictated, 7 birds really was not enough to inspire them to really do anything other than be coop mates, or there was no reproduction that occurred. As we found out in retrospect, these birds needed the companionship of their tens of thousands or their millions of flock mates in order to be able to reproduce successfully. And as their numbers dwindled, so did their ability to reproduce. Remember, each pair only produced 1 offspring. So whether they were reproducing or not, once the numbers got down so low, there really was very, very little hope for the species to be able to survive. So things got so bad that one by one, states were declaring the birds gone. Ohio, Indiana, even up in Maine, people were recording the days where they no longer saw passenger pigeons around. Well, I remember earlier on we saw that slide of the mural in downtown Cincinnati. Cincinnati is actually where the very last passenger pigeon expired. Her name was Martha. She was named after Martha Washington. And she was actually thought to have hatched in 1885. So she did live a fairly long life, but it was probably a somewhat lonely life. She died. Her caretakers found her dead on the floor of her enclosure around 1 p.m. on September 1st, 1914. And she was the very last living representative of this once extremely numerous species. It's kind of stirring to think that we not only know the year, but we also know the day, and we also know the time. It's almost as if we were able to look back into the history here in Kane County and say that on July 31st of a date 15,000 years ago, the very last mastodon died at 1 p.m. To be able to put that sort of that very fine note on the finish of the species is really quite stirring. There's been a lot written about Martha. There's the Cincinnati Zoo, in fact, has an exhibit all about the passenger pigeon, and she now is at the Smithsonian Institution with another preserved passenger pigeon named George, for George Washington. Speaking of preserved birds, there were a fair number of passenger pigeons that were taxidermied and preserved for posterity. I believe there's one on display up at the Elgin Public Museum in Elgin. The Jerica Museum of Natural History over at Benedictine in Lisle also has a passenger pigeon. The Field Museum has passenger pigeons in their collection as well. So we do have preserved representatives of the species. In fact, there's even some talk of using some of the DNA in those preserved specimens to try and bring the species back. That opens up a whole other topic of discussion of, if the bird was not able to survive in the presence of humans 100 years ago, how's it going to do today? And granted, we are much more careful with the wildlife we have. We have a lot of rules and regulations, which I'll discuss in just a second. But would it really be practical to bring back a bird that needs to have millions of counterparts in order to be able to survive? I don't know. We get cranky about Canada geese being too numerous sometimes. Anyway, some food for thought. Now, when the birds did disappear, remember science, we didn't have the ability to communicate and get kind of a broad spectrum view, a national view, an international view, the way we do today. Back then, the journal Science speculated that the birds were off in the deserts of Arizona. In another scientific journal called the Auk, they said, oh, they are just east of Puget Sound. Down in Chile, a gentleman said that he saw millions down there. Henry Ford was convinced that they had all drowned in the Pacific as they were trying to escape our country and fly to Asia. So lots of ideas, but really what it was they were hunted by humans until they were no more. That actually led to a piece of legislation called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Passenger pigeons were one of the reasons that this act came to be, but there were also other practices of the time that contributed to it. Basically, we were very, very hard on our wildlife neighbors without really having regard for the impacts that we were having. In the late 1800s, the hobby of bird egg collection was very popular. A bird nest collection was very popular. The practice of having large displays of taxidermied birds on in your home was considered a sign of status and wealth. And then over here on the right, this is a kind of an extreme example, but there was a fashion trend that women, particularly women, would wear hats with bird feathers. Many egrets and herons gave their lives so that women could appear fashionable with large arrays of feathers on their hats. So this wholesale killing, and you know, for the fashion industry, those birds weren't even being used for food. They were just they were killed. The few plumes that were grown for breeding were plucked, and the birds were cast aside. It was really a dark time, and it did, though, lead to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is still in effect today. Now, if you'd like to do a little bit more reading about the passenger pigeon, there's some neat references out there. In 2014, a local author, Joel Greenberg, wrote A Feathered River Across the Sky. He did a lot of research. Joel, maybe you're familiar with his other publication. Well, he's actually written several books, but there is a large volume called A Natural History of the Chicago Region, where he chapter by chapter looks at the various plants and animals of our area. That's a neat book too. But his book on passenger pigeon was a culmination of several years of research, and he actually planned it to be published on the 100th anniversary of Martha's passing and the species extinction. But it's an interesting read. You can definitely hear his naturalist voice coming through, and it's our most modern publication discussing the plight of the passenger pigeon. But I also wanted to mention a couple other things that I came upon in my research for today's talk. One is a website you might have heard of. It's called Project Gutenberg, and the web address is www.gutenberg.org. You can search from that main homepage and find all kinds of neat old texts and actually read them online. There's a book called The Passenger Pigeon. by William B. Mershon that relates a very page by page story of what happened, kind of as the story was unfolding. The other book is by William T. Hornaday. Our Vanishing Wildlife has chapters on the passenger pigeon, but also things like the American bison, another species that was thought to be going extinct, but as it turns out was rescued from the brink and has come back today in a slightly altered form. But in fact, William T. Hornaday, he was a taxidermist at the Smithsonian Institution back before it was the Smithsonian, when it was called the National Museum of Natural History. And he was witnessing as the naturalists would come back from their forays around the country. He, as the taxidermist, was then tasked with putting together lifelike representations of what they were bringing back. So on the one hand, he was working to preserve the memories of a lot of species, but on the other hand, he was witnessing firsthand how many of them were just being slaughtered and were disappearing before his eyes. So he wrote a very impassioned plea that he distributed to members of Congress to try and get them to consider the plight of wildlife. And it did ultimately, his effort, plus those of many others, did result in that Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So anyway, some neat resources that you might want to investigate if you were so inclined to learn more about this fascinating bird, the passenger pigeon. That wraps up today's talk. Next month, the month of February, we're going to be taking a look at what goes on in an interesting layer underneath the snow called the subnivean zone. I hope to present that to you then, whether we're still virtual or whether we get to be in person. I'll look forward to talking with you about that then. Thank you so much. Take care.